Hi, Josh.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm not complaining, as usual. Um, and I don't mean to suggest I have anything to complain about. I'm not saying that. But anyway, let me introduce us. I am Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is a Nonzero podcast. You're Josh Summers, noted meditation teacher and yoga teacher. As one might infer from the foliage behind you, that's people may not be able to see this because the extremes of your frame will get cut off in the production part, but those are lovely plants to your left and right.
All the decorative design of my partner for our yoga studio.
I see. So are
Uh,
you in your yoga studio at
This
that
are
moment?
yeah. This is the studio we shoot from for
Uh-huh.
our online classes and stuff.
Okay. So regular listeners and viewers may recognize you. You've been a guest repeatedly. We've talked through a lot of things, often having to do with meditation, um, and related matters and life generally. Today, we're going to talk about life generally. We're going to focus to some extent on cognitive empathy. That is just the challenge of understanding how other people view the world, which isn't the same as empathy in the more conventional sense of kind of feeling their pain, identifying with their feelings. It's just kind of perspective taking. And we're going to try to situate that subject in the challenge of like living a life. In other words, I mean, I've talked in the past about how it could help, I think, geopolitics if say the leaders of various nations were better at understanding the perspectives of people in other nations. But I think this also has relevance to our lives, and I think you agree, and I think you agree with me that it's a challenge to apply these uh, these things in real life. Are you with me so far?
I'm definitely with you. That's why I reached out after your newsletter. I think what you solicited, maybe domestic, personal, interpersonal ways in which people may experience lack of cognitive empathy or cognitive empathy deficit disorder. And when I read that, I've been feeling this for a while, but I think I'm a kind of a lab rat / canary in the coal mine for your very enterprise, in that I live in a with the pandemic, my life went into an upheaval and things have settled now, but I'm living in a very different set of circumstances than I was living in the past. As you mentioned, I was a teacher, a yoga teacher, and I was traveling around giving seminars and workshops and trainings and things like that. And the pandemic kind of cleared all that out, or killed it. And I also came out of a marriage at the beginning of the pandemic and got divorced, and relocated, resettled with my partner in Maine, but we're in a rural sort of setup. And one way of describing it, and this might land for you, but we both practice at the Insight Meditation Society. And behind the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, there's a smaller retreat center for long-term practitioners. And our place in Maine feels like a miniature version of the forest refuge. Long driveway in, lots of snow around, lots of trees, no visible neighbors. In some ways, perfectly idyllic conditions.
Mm-hmm.
The partnership itself is a deep love, one of the deepest loves I've ever known, if not the deepest, probably. And yet, even within those idyllic circumstances, I've been very aware of what can happen when a capacity for cognitive empathy is lost, and really painful cycles of conflict can kick up.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been looking at that, doing postmortems on conflicts with my partner, trying to understand it more. I've been in therapy, in couples therapy, trying to work through it, seeing what the roots of it are, and really trying to apply. And the irony here, which I think you might empathize with, but the irony of applying the very thing you're talking about. So you preach cognitive empathy, and I know in your book, Why Buddhism is True, nothing makes you lose cognitive empathy more when you perceive someone else not being cognitively empathic, and you get frustrated and tribalistic about it. The irony here is I teach meditation and mindfulness. I've been in
Let
the
me
mindfulness.
that's an interesting thing we should just freeze frame on for a second, is the way there can be a chain reaction of lack of cognitive empathy, because to the extent that someone, by virtue of failing to understand your perspective, antagonizes you, you will put them more and more in the kind of antagonist category, maybe not all the way in the enemy category, but there will be tension. And to the extent that that happens, you may have trouble exercising cognitive empathy, understanding where they're actually coming from. Now, why that is a long story. I've written about it a little, but it seems to be part of human nature that our capacity for accurately understanding people's perspectives can vary tremendously depending on what kind of category we're putting them in. Is it a friend or an ally, a close friend, ally on the one hand, enemy, rival on the other, something in between? Any position on this spectrum can bring distortions of a certain kind, but in a way, the most dramatic and explosive, I think, are as you start moving toward the antagonist side, the kind of enemy, rival. So that's just an interesting point, that there can be this kind of positive feedback cycle. Positive feedback being a misleading term to the extent that it suggests anything good, because the outcome is bad. But let me just, I just wanted to interrupt you and drill down on that. But that's an interesting point you made. So anyway, now you may proceed.
Well, yeah, and where I was going is the irony is that, I've been involved in embodiment yoga world, mindfulness world for a while, and yet the protocols of therapy and practice that have been prescribed to me in a way are the very things that I teach. So I've eaten a bit of humble pie, quite a bit of humble pie, and just I feel like I have just a deeper appreciation for the obstacles to cognitive empathy, the kind of the mind states, the emotional states, and the misperceptions that lead to escalations.
That's an interesting thing in its own right, because as you said, you and I have both done, long, at least in the sense of a week or longer, meditation retreats at the Insight Meditation Society. And at any of these retreat centers, there's almost an unspoken assumption that the teachers totally have their shit together, right? I mean, that's part of the presentation of self. They're not, and yet it's not true. And in fact, I would say it's often the case that the people drawn into the practice most intensively often have the biggest issues to work out. If you're, if you're living the perfect life, you're probably not going to, subject yourself to the various discomforts associated with a long-term meditation retreat, much less the ongoing kind of daily practice you need to follow that up with if you're going to, try to sustain some of the progress you made. So anyway, that's another little fact worth noting. The truth is, there are always these, and it does come out, like when Joseph Goldstein, a co-founder of the center, along with Sharon Salzberg and so on, the Insight Meditation Society, talks about the role that fear used to, how just the problem of fear in his life was such a big challenge for so long. And I'm sure it recurs, we all know these things you continue to grapple. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you again, but there are you're bringing up these interesting little things that I think it's good to think about. And in this case, just that everyone has their struggles.
Right. And in your naming, the challenge of anyone that tries to share these teachings around how do you present it in a way that people can connect with, but as I think teachers don't necessarily want to overshare their own personal mess, because then it creates this very odd dynamic with students too, where the students might be feeling like they need to take care of you, or something like that. But the flip side is also what I think you were naming in the beginning, around the projection students will have on the teacher, like, oh, they're up there, so they've figured it out, or they don't have that problem. And the line that always comes to me is one of the monks that would teach at IMS, Ajahn Sachito, often would say, when someone would talk about their anxiety, talk about their fear, talk about their self-loathing or shame, he'd say, sounds like me.
That's, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've gotten feedback from people who are kind of surprised when they hear my podcast, how animated, I guess would be the euphemism for the way I get sometimes. But they're like, wait, I thought you were this mindfulness guy. There's a reason I had to get interested in mindfulness.
But if I may, that also speaks to projection about what people think mindfulness will do.
Right.
And if people think mindfulness is going to take away their symptoms directly, or magically, then just because you go on one retreat or you take up a practice and suddenly your stress is going to vanish, or your anxiety issue is going to vanish, like that's Pollyannish, in my opinion.
So let me before we get back into your story, mention one more thing. So as you said, you were responding to a post I did in the Nonzero newsletter, in which I invited people to submit comments through or questions about this subject through one of two avenues, either in the comments section, which is open to paid subscribers, or just by emailing us. And I first of all was surprised by how many people came from a mindfulness background. I mean, it seems like at least half of them were automatically situating the challenge of cognitive empathy in that context. And the other theme was that a couple of these people talked about the connection between self exploration and becoming more aware of the way your own mind works and cognitive empathy, and arguing that the kind of understanding of your own internal dynamics that mindfulness can bring can be helpful in the realm of understanding others. And I realized for the first time something that I think is just worth throwing out there, which is that there are two very different meanings of self-awareness that have different connections to cognitive empathy. Normally, when we say that person's not very self-aware, what we really mean is that is just a statement about their lack of cognitive empathy, because normally all we mean by that is they don't understand how other people are perceiving them. If you look at the way the term is usually used, oh, he's just totally lacking in self-awareness, we mean like he didn't realize, like, that joke didn't work, or people thought he was an asshole. I think usually, lacking in self-awareness is actually a statement about awareness of other people's minds as those minds relate to you. However,
could it also be, lack of the statement, they're not self-aware, also mean they just don't see the world the way I see the world? I think that's part of it too. They're not seeing things the way I see them, so they're not self-aware.
Well, what would be an example? I mean, normally, if I would just say they're clueless if they don't see the world the way I see it. I don't know. I mean, I think. Well, let me say just the other half of what I was going to say was that the kind of self-awareness that these commenters and correspondents were talking about was more about actual internal observation. And self-awareness is actually ironic in this context, because ultimately, according to Buddhism, which is where which is what the concept of mindfulness is associated with, there in some sense is no self. And in fact, observing your internal dynamics leads you to realize that this thing you had thought of as the self, this solid, persistent thing, is nothing of the sort. So there's that irony, but still, loosely speaking, what these people are suggesting is that becoming more aware of the self-awareness of that sense, becoming more aware of your internal dynamics, can help you understand how other people are seeing the world, what's going on in their minds. And that's kind of true. It's actually not the main way I would have said that mindfulness can be conducive to cognitive empathy. Uh, I would have said that mindfulness can lead you to relax your judgments about people. And I know one of the people who wrote in, maybe we'll come to it, uh, mentioned that very explicitly. The idea that relaxing judgment is a prerequisite um, for understanding people. But uh, I think that's one of the main contributions mindfulness can make to cognitive empathy. But that's different from what these people are suggesting, which is that understanding the way your own mind works through mindfulness uh, can help. So does that?
Yeah, no, we could jump off a few of those themes. Being aware, I mean, one way I would paraphrase it back is being aware of becoming more aware of my own internal process, how my mind works, how my mind perceives things, how it takes sense data, turns it into a story, projects intention that may or may not be there and with the outside actor. Becoming more aware of that process in some ways makes me more skeptical around my own certainty. So in a way, certainty is the sin. Certainty, when I feel really certain, I can now see in hindsight, in those instances when the moments I'm most certain are when I'm most vulnerable to not being able to see things from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, I think, sort of related there. And then so the stance that gets adopted is more of inquisitive curiosity around just asking an open question. Well, what is it like for you? How are you seeing this? And then being able to reflect that back to the satisfaction of the interlocutor so that they feel like they've been heard. All of that stems from awareness of internal process.
Mm-hmm.
But then I don't know if you've gotten into this, but the cognitive empathy, the way I look at it now, is also that it's an activity. It's a process that you're engaged with, and part of the process is uncomfortable because to truly exercise it, you have to sit. I often have to sit with difficult sensations, difficult feelings that scream at me to say something else, to do something else.
Well, what can you? I don't want to invade your privacy too much, but is it possible to put a little more flesh on the kind of thing that would be?
So I've been, in anticipation of this call, I've been trying to figure out how to distill it down in a nutshell so that it gives a sense of the punch, but without maybe necessarily going overboard with TMI. So what I mentioned, living in more or less solitude with my partner, teaching, working. We're living by cheek and jowl, doing everything
which is
together.
very challenging, by the way.
Yeah, no, I mean,
seclusion has its upsides and its downsides, but go ahead.
Seclusion, but working together. Also, we run a business together, and our couples therapist thinks we're nuts for doing all of this. But at the same time, it's a crucible for really working out and ironing out communication skills so that things don't go off the rails. One of the things that's been challenging for me, and I have even really fresh insight around why it's challenging, but one of the things that's been challenging is as we merged, she also has two teenage sons. One's now 20, one's 18. They're both in college now. But for 2 years, the youngest one was finishing high school with us. And that's a tricky dynamic to merge households or to merge personalities under best of times. And often what would happen, whether there'd be some behavior, whether it was leaving dishes, leaving lights on, leaving the door open, leaving things, clothes all over the place. There was some behavior that would irritate me. really irritate me. And then I would craft a story around it that this is obviously due to a deficiency in the way this child was taught or raised. And that's so you can hear how that goes into a poisonous judgment against my partner. And then when I would speak to her about it, I would come in, just riding on the coattails of that judgment. Things didn't go so well. Things wouldn't go so well.
So it was, you felt in you a condemnation of both the son and the son's mother, basically, right?
Yeah, but in a cooler state,
a criticism, a critical judgment.
I could be hypercritical, but feeling, and this is what one of the commentators or one of the people that emailed you wrote about, with like feeling a righteousness. It's a little bit like this is the last chance we have while he's in high school, to really plant some seeds of higher consciousness in him, to be more aware, to be more self-aware. And so it's that there's more of the irony that I'm trying to get, want her to get him to be more self-aware, but being pretty unaware about how I'm communicating that.
So you mean you weren't sufficiently aware of how defensively she would react to criticism? I mean, did you make these criticisms explicit? Like, if you had raised this kid better. By the way, my advice, I'm not a professional couples counselor. Never start a sentence with the words, if you had raised this kid better. Was that the kind of vibe?
It wouldn't start there. It would definitely not start there, but it could, at times it could get there. And then in the extreme, like when things would go nuclear, and it did feel existential at times. It's like, are we going to be able to do this? Are we going to be able to keep this going? Are we going to be able to survive here? It would get to that pitch.
Yeah.
I say with shame.
But of course, at that point, you're kind of, it's just a challenge to be deliberate and careful in the conversation, because at that point, it's just a heated conversation. But there's, at that point, the intent is almost to hurt. It's almost not like you don't understand it's going to hurt him. Of course you do. You're wielding it as a weapon, right? At that point in the argument. So it's almost, I don't, I'm not sure whether, what is the opportunity to exercise cognitive empathy there? I'm just asking myself out loud. I mean, when in fact, your feeling at that point is, I mean, we've all been there. You want to harm the person psychologically, right? I mean, you're mad at them. You want to say something. On the one hand, you believe it, and at least you believe it when you're pissed off, right? Like you believe it when you're feeling uncharitable, and you've felt it repeatedly, but not articulated it. But part of articulating at that point is in some sense a desire to hurt the person, right? I mean, you're mad. You want to, there's, conversations can escalate into just pure insult, right? Arguments can start out over, like with a neighbor over a some issue of like, whose tree is this? Who's, is this on your, weren't you supposed to take it? It can start out on some factual basis and wind up with, you're always like this, you're blah, blah, blah. So it can escalate into pure insult. And the escalation's a very subtle thing. And maybe judging by your reaction, your facial reaction, it seems to me that you don't agree that you were very far along, in this case, on the path toward just wanting to cause psychological harm to the person you're arguing with. But at some point you get there, right? When you're just hurling insults at someone, I mean, on the one hand, they are grievances, and you may want the person to hear them, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, I would say that the intent to harm was never there. It would, if you paused me in one of these cycles, I might say, I just feel like I have to say this because we need to bring awareness to this problem.
See, I would say, if you think that is the full extent of your motivation, maybe you could have used a little more self-awareness at that point. That's just my reading of human psychology, right? Is that there are layers and layers of actual motivation. The actual motivation is rarely the thing you feel like articulating, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I wasn't even aware of that's the thing. I wasn't even aware of why this was such a thing for me.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
and I do have more insight around that. It goes into the legs of my past. For one, both her sons are very successful athletes. The youngest is on a full scholarship at University of Maine, playing baseball, Division I, star pitcher. And what does that have to do with anything? Well, I've recently really remembered and reappraised experiences I had in high school where I realize now that I was more or less bullied chronically for 3 years by the athletes of the school, like the Goonish gang. And, you know, I touched into how angry that made me, how much rage that instilled in me, and then how much judgment and bias I have against any of that culture. And so the behavior is that I was getting triggered by was part of that coming from that culture, but there was no intention to harm, or I mean, it was harmless stuff. But my level of reaction was just totally displaced.
which was harmless. You mean there was no intention to harm who on whose part?
On the son's part.
You weren't trying to harm him.
I wasn't trying to harm him either, but he wasn't trying to harm me, and I wasn't trying to harm him. But I was taking it like an affront, a personal affront. So, I mean, there's actually, I think there is an example, a specific one, where last winter, in the middle of the night, we both woke up, my partner and I woke up, and we woke up to the smoke alarm chirping.
I hate that.
I hate it too. Because it can be a long time before you figure out which smoke alarm it actually is.
Right.
Came down, we figured out which one it was, but when we came downstairs, the reason why it was smoking was because the internal temperature of the house had dropped down to 40 degrees. The intention, and that happened. The house
you need a stupider smoke alarm. That's more. That alarm is doing too much thinking. But go ahead.
Well, no, I think when I looked it up, it's something about the cold makes the battery malfunction. So
I see. I thought that was part of the built-in design. Was it thought if the house is too cold, something must be wrong. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, it is telling you the battery won't work when it's too cold. But the reason why it was so cold, drum roll, was because the door of the house to the garage was open, and the door of the garage bay, one of the bays of the garage door.
And who had left those doors open, Josh?
Exactly. We know who it was, Bob.
Was it your partner?
No.
Was it you? Was it the son? Who was it?
It was the young fellow, the son.
Oh, God, that's intolerable.
But listen, the story's not over. So, but when I say I got triggered, like, you know, I'm a mindfulness yoga guy. I could feel my body get tighter. Right. Taut guitar string instantly. I mean, I seized up like I've only seized up once or twice in my life. I could barely walk.
Did that not allow you to intervene and stop the process of murdering the?
Well, no, so the context though is the son had a friend over that night, and the deal was
kill them both, man. That's what I would have done.
Before we went to bed, we told them when the friend leaves, shut the door, close the garage door, etc.
Yeah.
What happened, and this is after I already did verbally blame the son for leaving the door open. He said,
"Is that a euphemism? Verbally blamed?" If we heard the verbal blame, would we think that more colorful adjectives were in order?
I actually wrote about this. I put it into a Dharma talk once, and by my recollection, see, sometimes when I get really angry, an Irish accent slips out of me, an Irish way of speaking, just because I spent time over in Ireland when I was in university. And so I said, "Do you realize you're after leaving the door open?"
That's funny.
But it was the way I said it.
Yeah.
It was like the finger of blame was there. But then he said, and he was pretty calm about it, he said, "I'm so sorry, we fell asleep."
And you said, yeah, you know why you fell asleep? No, what did you say?
I just said, well, it interrupted my whole narrative of blame because he had fallen asleep and he never let his friend out. So he wasn't involved in touching the door. He never touched the door. So the reason the door was open, because of the wind.
Wind did it.
So
Good.
what bias, Bob? What bias did I fall prey to?
You tell me. Well, I guess what, confirmation bias or
and or attribution
attribution
error.
error. Yeah, those are the two leading candidates always. I'm just thinking, yeah, so because you were saying well, the openness of the door is a reflection of your character, and in fact it was a reflection of the wind circumstance.
Right. All there was like, in a kind of a Buddhist analysis where there was raw sensation of intense cold, winter wind blowing through the downstairs of the house, a fear around pipes freezing, but there was this raw sensation. And then the way that I became certain of a certain narrative being true.
Yeah, that's a classic, it's a classic thing. I mean, we've all been there. And the purpose of I mean, it gets back to what I was saying about in what senses can self-awareness, we'll leave aside cognitive empathy. In what senses can self-awareness kind of help you stop the cycle of escalation before it gets out of hand? And one of them is what you involves what you mentioned, which is surely being aware of the process of the feelings that are arising that are kind of warning signs, right? I mean, I remember after my first meditation retreat, and only a couple of days afterwards, so I was still really kind of in the zone. And one of my, at that point, young daughters did something that made me want to chastise her or yell at her or something. And I just remember feeling the urge to do it rise up and observing the urge and just saying, no, I don't think I will. And that was like a new feeling. To have that degree of detachment from, from and reflection on your own feelings. And I wouldn't say that's a case of cognitive empathy per se being facilitated. It's just a case of the stopping of the spiral that involves diminished cognitive empathy in various ways. It both is a product of it and leads to it, can be facilitated by self-awareness, if that makes sense. I mean,
and
yeah.
being able to put your hand on the brake or put your foot on the brake, I would say is an essential prerequisite for the activity of cognitive empathy to flow. If you're not able, if you can't if you can't track your internal state, and know yourself when things are getting to the point of escalation in terms of sensation, you won't be able to play the edge of being a good communicator.
Right. Because as we said, it is there is this just positive feedback cycle by which antagonism makes cognitive empathy harder, and that in turn, just makes it harder to consider the perspective of the other person and come up with reasons why they did something you don't like, other than they're just a terrible person. And then, the harder it is to exercise the cognitive empathy, the more pissed off you get, the harder it gets to exercise cognitive empathy. And then the extreme case is at a geopolitical level is war. I mean, if you look at how two enemies process information about each other, it's just, for a while, it's just out of control. There's no hope.
Well, I made a note somewhere that it's the theme of the security dilemma at domestic scale.
Yeah, so the security dilemma is the idea from political science, from international relations specifically, that well, something it involves is perceiving actions that are intended defensively as offensive. I mean, I'm actually just writing a piece right now about a memo written by the ambassador to Russia in 2008, warning, kind of implicitly warning against extending NATO membership to Ukraine. And he was talking about the Soviet foreign minister, or Russian foreign minister, Lavrov. First of all, saying, you got to recognize, you may see NATO as a defensive alliance. We see it as a threat. And that can mean two things. I mean, in this case, Lavrov said that doesn't mean we think you mean it offensively, but it means that we have no idea who's going to be president of America in 20 years, in 10 years, and what they might do with Ukraine if it's NATOized, right? So that's one version of the security dilemma, where Russia felt they saw something that maybe was intended defensively, but they perceived it as an offensive threat. In that case, it wasn't really a misreading of intentions, but what you're talking about, it was more precautionary than a misreading of current intentions. But what you're talking about is a flat out misreading of intentions. Somebody says something and you take it as offensive when they don't mean it that way. Of course, one complication here is we're often not in touch with the fact that we actually mean things offensively when we don't consciously, you know what I mean? I mean, it's like I was saying, at some point in an argument, you want to harm the person, right? You want them to feel psychological pain. It's become a weaponized conversation, but you may not be reflecting, you may not be thinking that, and yet it can be true. I don't know. I'm going to stop talking now. I'm thinking so many things about this. But anyway, your point is that, especially amid hostility, but even amid kind of just incipient tension, it can be easy to read something as aggressive, offensive, that is not meant that way.
Yes, and that was one of the insights that I've come to in couples therapy.
Mm-hmm.
In sort of, my partner and I do this on our own, but we've also done it with the help of a therapist. But it's something I mentioned to you before, around an exercise of reflective dialogue, or reflective communication, where one person says something, the other person listens. After the first person speaks, the second person reflects back what they heard, paraphrasing it to the satisfaction of the first speaker, before something else is said. And in doing that, and really sort of doing a postmortem on some of the conflicts, and really kind of analyzing it frame by frame, like in a movie kind of directorial way. From point A to point B in the dynamic, what was going on there? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? What was I thinking? What was I feeling? How was I interpreting? How are you interpreting? Going through that, it becomes clear again and again that, sighs, subtle eye rolls, grimaces of the face, frantic rubbing of the head, or whatever it is, there's body language, there's verbal signals that do get interpreted incorrectly. I know my partner will say she's feeling more defensive, she's just trying to take care of herself. I experience it as an aggression, vice versa. But it's that feedback loop in the escalation.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I mean, I let me try to do a slightly better job of articulating what I had said. Is a complication here is that there is such a thing as passive aggressive behavior, right? And various related things. I mean, there is such a thing as having more aggressive intent than the formal meaning of your words would suggest. Because I know I do that with my wife. I know for sure that I say, uh, did you do X when I mean, God damn it, you did X again? Or do you know who did X? Even worse? Do you know how this happened? Do you know how the door got left open when you're thinking, God damn it, you're the one who left the door open, right? Um, so this is one thing that makes it a very complicated landscape. Reading the intentions of others is that intention itself is such a slippery concept. I mean, we all may indeed have aggressive agendas that we're at best dimly aware of.
Mhm.
Um, and
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that needs to be part of the question of how we cultivate self-awareness. Is what are the limits of self-awareness? What are we just don't have access to?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, well, quite frankly, I had done a lot of meditation practice, and I would say a lot of my practice was internally. It's kind of a bubble of isolation, and I don't mean like I was living on a retreat all the time, but my practice was insular in the sense that it was something I did in private,
Mm-hmm.
and it was only. I feel like it's only been in the light of this particular relationship that I've had to apply my practice in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a way that I have come to a new level of self-awareness through the reflection I get back from my partner and vice versa. But the Trungpa had the line like, next to your guru, your partner is your greatest teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And it just speaks to this idea that through an interpersonal relationship, the relationship will mirror yourself back to you in a way that you can't do on your own. You simply can't do on your own.
Yeah.
So certain things can't be worked out unless they're worked out in the living. They can't be worked out kind of in the abstract, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think, I do think it's funny. On the one hand, I do think that, a pretty serious mindfulness practice can make you better at fathoming kind of your own motivation, make you more aware when you say, do you know who left the door open, that there's a deeper agenda there, and that actually you have a grievance and you've already decided who left the door open, and so on. I think mindfulness can make you more aware of kind of your hidden agenda, and I think that's a very constructive thing if you act on the information. At the same time, mindfulness carried far enough will lead you into a different paradigm in terms of how you're thinking of the self, right? Where it's not like there's a you that has the agenda. It's more like there are these various things floating around in your sphere of confidence that are generating various feelings that lead to various things, and so on. So there's that kind of irony that we alluded to at the beginning, I guess, that concept of self ultimately becomes slippery. But
Well,
you agree with me that mindfulness it can help you uh, become aware when you're when you've got a more hostile agenda than you may have otherwise been admitting to yourself.
yeah, that's become very clear.
Yeah.
And I would say that the key to that for me has been the somatics of it.
Yeah, meaning what?
Meaning just being much more dialed into the physical state, primarily from the neck to my pelvis, like what's going on there, and learning how to interpret the data that I get from that sensation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know now, because one of the things that kept coming back to me in the couples therapy was, like the therapist would say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So even when you said something like, "Were you aware that you left the door?" or did you not put the
Yeah.
do you know who didn't put the dish away?
Yeah.
There may be this. It's not so much the words itself. There's the affect and the emotion that's
Yeah.
coming with the words that I think is part of the murkier context in which the conflict can whip up.
Yeah.
But I do think, yeah, I mean, your question was, does mindfulness help that? I would say it's a first step to knowing what's going on internally. And there's a kind of a contemporary form of therapy. I guess it's been around since the 80s. I looked it up this morning, called ACT. It's acceptance commitment therapy. And one of the key features of it is it doesn't at all try to diminish symptoms. So whatever symptom the person's experiencing, they don't try to diminish it. It first involves bringing mindful awareness to it so that it can be accepted, maybe fully acknowledged. But then the commitment part of it is, by accepting the way it is, the person, the individual, would then commit to internally generated values, or externally generated, but maybe not internally, but just values that they align with. Rather than, so for example, in the examples we've been using, if I would speak in a way that was too judgmental, that's not really, in a manner of communication that's aligned with the values of my higher angels, if you will. And that's been I think an interesting piece that I had not really integrated in my practice for a while.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many parts to this. I don't know. I don't know where to go. It's there's so many different dynamics that can be kind of happening in a relationship, including kind of implicit attempts to renegotiate, and one's sense of entitlement and power can change. I just thought of this as neither here nor there. It's just an interesting and weird document. Have you ever read that brutal letter that Einstein wrote to his wife?
No.
Well, it's like he's become this famous guy, and I think he's got some other woman he's interested in. But in those days, you didn't get divorced, and it's just like, okay, here's the way it's going to be. You will do this and that. You will do the wash. You will cook my stuff. You will my food. You will do this. You will do that. You'll do that. You will not talk back to me. I mean, I don't know if this is all literal, but it's just a horrifyingly, I guess give him credit. He's just kind of being honest. He's like, it's like, this is, he's all but saying, this is what I'm entitled to. I'm like this big, powerful guy. You're nobody. And if you want to stick around, this is the way it's going to be. And, often I think, that's a very dramatic kind of change of power, but, bargaining power in some sense or another does change as people go through. I mean, just for example, a woman having a child can, in a certain sense, reduce her bargaining power. Because if a guy leaves her a month after her child is born, I mean, I think most guys don't feel like doing that a month after a child is born because they're in love with the child happily. But that's a tough position to be in, right? So anyway, it's all very complicated, and sometimes I think there are these implicit demands for renegotiation of the contract going on, when that's the subtext, and maybe sometimes it's better just to talk about that, but I don't know. Look, I'm not the last thing I would be is a good couples counselor, so I think I'm going to shut up now. But there was a certain amount, there was quite a bit of kind of interesting feedback that we got in response to my call for feedback. Let me just read a couple of things and see if they may or may not have to do with couples stuff, or even quite with cognitive empathy. Here's the shortest one, possibly, from Tim. A comment: Buddhist teachers recommend the value of concentration practices to complement insight and compassion. In my experience, concentration practice helps me develop deeper insight into myself and others. I'm wondering what you think about that, Josh. I mean, concentration tends to be involved in various kinds of meditation, certainly including mindfulness, but in concentration meditation per se, you really stick with that part of it. You focus on the one thing. It's like the one time I had just a psychedelic level, mystical, whatever kind of wild experience through meditation. It was through focusing on the breath really intensively and sticking with it, and not then, with mindfulness practice or insight meditation, which is closely related to mindfulness. You might focus on something long enough to establish a kind of calm and equanimity that allows you to better observe all the things going on in your body and your mind, whatever. And then you do that, right? But with pure concentration meditation, you know more about this than I do, I think. I mean, at least you've done more of this kind of stuff. You stick with the concentration. So that's the distinction that Tim is referring to between kind of insight meditation and concentration meditation. What is your feeling about the role of concentration? I mean, do you see it mainly as kind of a table setter for insight, the way I've described it, or?
I think you're presenting it the way it is often presented, that there's a kind of a progression, that a novice meditator will be told to focus and concentrate on an object like the breath or a mantra, or a body sweep even, and to come back to that experience again and again every time the mind drifts and wanders. And then, in the context of vipassana or insight meditation, that there's a sort of often named a requisite level of steadiness of presence that's required before someone can really succeed at seeing phenomena more clearly, seeing the impermanent nature, the unsatisfactory nature, the non-self nature of all experience. So I think that in my own framing of it, I don't necessarily see them as all that divergent. That they kind of the word for concentration or tranquility practice in Pali is shamatha. Sometimes you're told to do shamatha meditation and then do vipassana. I kind of see them working in parallel or in a kind of in an integrated way of shamatha vipassana together, because and this is what I think the commenter might be getting at, is that you can't do in concentration practice without gaining insight about yourself. Because the first insight you get is that your mind is not under your control the way you might perceive it or imagine it to be. It becomes you become disabused of the power of your own agency very quickly, and that's an insight. It's a valuable insight.
Yeah.
But there's another point that I think also connects a yoga or embodiment practice to the development of concentration, or I would say the development of samadhi. So, but by doing a concentration practice, the outcome.
So what's there are three terms you've used. Vipassana is insight.
Yep. To see clearly is one of the translations. Right. Shamatha is often translated as tranquility. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Or calm abiding. And samadhi is, people actually use these terms differently, so it can get a little confusing. But samadhi is, the way I look at it, is it's the experience of a unification of your being. It doesn't necessarily mean you're kind of alienated from sensory experiences. Like, you still hear birds chirping, you still hear cars honking, you still feel your body, but there's a unification of being that's often characterized by an internal calm and clarity. And I would say, from my sense of it, my experientially, but also from studying around this stuff, there's a spectrum of these samadhi states. Some are very, very deep and kind of on the range of what you're describing in your semi-hallucinogenic state on that retreat. But in terms of the function of samadhi within the development of wisdom, one of the ways I conceive of it is that when you access samadhi, when you really feel what you can feel kind of reliably with a yoga practice, and I would say it develops in meditation too. But when you access that that internal state of calm clarity, it becomes a reference point for when you're not in that state. So, meaning sometimes, like, my own default was it's taken me years to see this, but I was wound and programmed from conditions in life to be exceptionally anxious, and that had a whole tone of somatic correlate in my body. It was only when I started doing yoga and kind of temporarily cleared that anxiety out of my system for a moment or two, for an hour after class, that I started to realize how my default was so kind of tightly wound.
Yeah, I don't think it's unusual to feel a lot of anxiety, but yeah, I have, not through yoga, but through meditation, have had somewhat similar experience, I think, of the more careful awareness of it helping. Let me do quickly a couple of other things. Commenter whose name is Gamp quotes Mrs. Harris. Okay. Says, I'm coming at the whole cognitive empathy thing with disadvantage. I've never been interested in literature. Is this my wife? It sounds like my wife. This may be my, no, I don't think it's my wife, but she has accused me of not being interested in literature as she would like. I mean, I've read novels, but it's true that, as this commenter says, quote, and novels, and to a lesser extent short stories and plays, have been the great force for cognitive empathy since the 1800s. I think there's actually been some kind of documentation of this, or somebody enlisted this in an argument, the role that novels played in making people aware, especially of the way perspectives may differ in different cultures and so on. I plead guilty
different
to
class too, right?
Yeah, different, classes within societies, and so on. Brian Schmerian,
Before you go into Brian Schmein, I mean, I don't know if the commenter got at this, but just the act of reading a novel, I would argue, is a kind of exercise or training in cognitive empathy, because it invites the reader to adopt the perspective of the protagonist or a character or this or a situation, and see how conditions conspire so that the character acts one way or another. So there's that in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, I'd say there's lots of ways to nurture cognitive empathy. And I just when I'm not reading novels, I could read more novels, but sometimes I'm doing things like watching documentaries about different cultures and things, or watching movies, or actually reading things that actual people have said. There are a lot of ways to nurture cognitive empathy. So I'm not gonna lose a lot of sleep over the way I'm allocating my time. I certainly grant that all of these technologies, I mean, a novel is kind of technology, have played a role in broadening the potential range of cognitive empathy, both, within a society and across societies. But I would say that all kinds of things have. Video has, audio has, journalism, and so on. Ryan just observes the anger comes first and the reasoning comes second. I'll just leave that there because it's speaks to so much of what we've already said.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Martin S. is one of the people who mentions this idea that, that self-awareness can help. Writes, a few years of contemplative practice have convinced me that the best starting point is to develop and practice cognitive empathy towards oneself. I mean, in a way, I guess in a way, mindfulness is cognitive empathy towards the self, right? I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, that's, somebody else brought up the relationship between stories. Now, was that one of the comments or one of the emails? You saw all of them. I think it was in one of the emails.
Kyle's email.
It was Kyle's email.
Who was talking about Chris Argyris's ladder of inference.
Okay. Okay, yeah, there was a sentence I wanted to kind of drill down on in that email from Kyle. I have to be able to. It seems like having something that is truly cognitive empathy or perspective taking means that I have to be able to separate out my own external stimuli so I can see the external stimuli others are experiencing apart from the story we attach to it. Now, that's true, and I think consistent with a lot we've said, that in other words, you have to try to let go of the story you're attaching to what they're doing. But at the same time, you can't let go of the story they're attaching to it. In other words, understanding the story they're attaching to their motivation is cognitive empathy, right? I mean that's kind of the thing that makes me a little reluctant to sign on to any straightforward, simple rendering of the idea that understanding the self is the same as understanding the other person. I mean, I think understanding the self can in various ways be conducive to it, but this is the big difference. It seems to me that if you really want to deeply understand yourself, you have to let go of the stories that you're attaching to your own motivation and take a deeper look at what's actually going on in there. Whereas you don't want to. I mean, doing that with them would be kind of a mixed blessing, because job one in understanding the perspective is understanding the story they're attaching to things. That's kind of what it is to understand their perspective. It's like, does Putin see Ukraine as part of Russia? Well, if he does, we need to understand that. If that's part of his motivation, we need to understand that. Would a more mindful Putin let go of that? Maybe, but that's not the one we're dealing with. So there's this irony. I mean, that's the kind of a certain kind of asymmetry I see between understanding yourself better and understanding other people better. I think a goal or part of the process of understanding yourself more and more deeply is to let go of some of the stories, let go of stories generally, ideally, maybe. Whereas in a way, you don't want to do that with other people because the stories are motivating them. They haven't let go of them yet, right? Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm going to. So the asymmetry you're finding is that internally, when you're cultivating self-awareness, I'm hearing you say we're trying to let go of our stories.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're exercising cognitive empathy with others, we're trying to understand their story.
Right. Yeah. And you want to. Yeah.
Yeah, you want to. So a way I would approach that is that the self-awareness piece isn't all that different, in that letting go of the story doesn't mean you're getting rid of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another whole form of therapy called internal family systems, which is very simpatico with Buddhist practice and philosophy. My own first therapist, who was a Buddhist teacher, was very much taken by this form of psychotherapy. But the basic premise is that our internal world is not made up of one unilateral self. The internal world is a multiplicity of selves.
Mm-hmm.
And those internal selves are parts of us. They're called parts in the system. The internal parts have their own narratives. They have their own fears. They have their own roles and functions within our broader sense of self. And so what's interesting about the therapeutic model is that the individual begins a dialogue process with these internal parts. Mm-hmm. And I would say the main part of that process is to develop cognitive empathy with the part. So what is the part's name? What is the part's role? Mm-hmm. What is it and understanding it, core self, the sense of awareness, and the curious, aware, engaged, connected self is able to unblend from being fused with that part, to see it, and then to, in a sense, over time, unburden the part from its maladaptive role.
Right.
And so, but in doing that, when you do it with yourself, it's not a big leap to start doing it with another person. So and this gets to what other people.
Well, what is doing it with another person? Well, so this is I don't know if this is the same. I mean, what does doing it with another person consist of? I mean, first of all, it's harder. You're not in their head. But what does
The thread is the dialogue. It's the way of communicating with the internal part or
right?
with another person. See,
Oh, I see.
this is what I mean about the
Yeah.
idea of cognitive empathy as an activity. I think it requires skills in communication, massive skills in communication. I needed a massive, and I'm continuing to upgrade it, but a massive upgrade in my communication skills, which are very limited prior to this.
Yeah, I mean, you're not always in communication with a person you're trying to understand. I will never talk to Vladimir Putin, but it's in my interest to understand what motivates him. But go ahead. Yeah, it can be a big help if you are in communication with that person. Yeah.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's somebody you are in communication with, but there are real limits on what you're allowed to say. Like if it's a boss, and so on. But yeah, I agree that that's an asset. And in the kinds of things we're talking about, like relationships of a personal kind, that option should be available. Yeah.
Well, and yeah, there was another person who wrote in about finding cognitive empathy was helping them with online dating.
Uh-huh.
And just it was, and what I took from that share was that it was the ability to more understand somebody, whether the relationship worked out, whether the date led into a relationship, or they parted as friends. The direction it moved was a better direction because of the cognitive empathy of the increase of understanding between the two parties.
Yeah. Um. There's just one more thing on this subject is that I think sometimes when people say, and I may be talking about somebody who actually mentioned this, I'm not sure, but uh when they say that, awareness of what's going on in your own mind can make you more empathetic to the other person, I think sometimes they actually don't mean cognitive empathy so much as emotional empathy and a kind of almost forgiveness. In other words, you see what's driving you toward irrational anger or this or that or that, and you see how it happens. And then you see somebody else who seems irrationally angry, and you go, well, like all of us, they're just victims. I mean, there's this shit going on in their head. They don't totally understand it. And this one part of the self is in control right now. It's happened to all of us. I can relate to that, and therefore I'm more uh, forgiving of that. Now, again, I'd say that's not exactly the same as cognitive empathy because that's not the way they're looking at it. They're looking at it as if they have a right to be angry and on and on. And you need to understand that. And it seems to me understanding that is the first and maybe core part of cognitive empathy. And when we say that understanding the way anger happens within ourselves makes us more empathetic to them, I think sometimes what we mean is it makes us more emotionally empathetic to them, more forgiving of them, and so on. And that has a value too, but I think there's a subtle kind of distinction there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, being aware of one's own internal state and how something like anger or judgment or criticism might arise.
Mm-hmm.
In Buddhist terms, what I hear you describing is wisdom. When someone understands the conditional nature of
Mm-hmm.
their state, that's
Right.
not because they're hardwired one way. It's just that the conditioned nature of their state is such that in that moment, the factors that give rise to anger are strongest.
Yeah.
Right. And so that wisdom of understanding how a state like anger will arise when you see it external, if you can see it in yourself, you know that the other person is held within the grip of those conditions that are present within them.
Right. Yeah, and
Right.
there's totally value in that.
Deepa, well, and but it speaks to what I think one of the main impediments to cognitive empathy is the projection of essential characteristic or trait on the other or on oneself. So essentialism, perception of essentialism is the enemy of cognitive empathy on some levels, right?
In a way, I mean, essentialism is something you have to be, kind of drill down on. But I mean, in a way, we're talking about attribution error when, if it's somebody, if it's an enemy and they do something bad, you're more inclined to attribute it to their fundamental disposition, as opposed to saying, well, circumstances conspired to make them behave like an asshole in this particular case. With enemies, we tend to go for the first explanation, like they're just an asshole. They are essentially an asshole. It's like their essence to be an asshole, and that's why they do bad things. And I would say in that sense, yeah, one of the impediments to cognitive empathy is indeed essentialism, and attribution error encourages it in the case of enemies and rivals who do bad things. So yeah, I think, there's a whole deeper. I mean, we don't have time to get into the whole Buddhist philosophical view on essence, on seeing essence in things, but I would say that's different but related. But to what I just said, but yeah, I agree that viewing people as essentially anything is usually a mistake. Yeah.
Yeah, and then again, I'm just trying to articulate or identify the hurdles to cognitive empathy,
Mm-hmm.
and whether if you're really triggered, really aroused, you're really angry, if you're seeing an essence, if you're victim to attribution error, it makes it so much harder to, at least on an interpersonal level, ask the question, speak in a way, communicate in a way that will establish the bridge of that. I can't remember if I've shared this with you before, but the late Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck used to describe in her book Everyday Zen or Nothing Special, one of them, she compared human beings to ice cubes, like frozen pattern. Have you heard this one? Have I gone this
I don't
on
think
this road
so.
before? Okay, so she says, a human being is basically a frozen ice cube of habit patterns. So what
Mm-hmm.
she meant. And when one ice cube slides into another ice cube, chips will fly. But she compares practice to bringing the light of the sun, light of warmth of awareness to the ice cube, and the ice cube starts to melt.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, full enlightenment might be the ice cube becomes a puddle, a complete puddle. But even without full enlightenment, and this is sort of the incremental form of enlightenment that you advocate, I hear you advocating, even with a little bit of practice or a consistent practice, the ice cube starts to melt, a puddle forms, and then the magic is that when another ice cube comes in contact with the puddle, what happens? It starts to melt as well.
Right. Right.
And I say that because, I know I've fallen into this trap.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be cognitive empathic if you're not going to be cognitive empathic.
Right. Right. Well, it's the
But
flip side of the positive, the pernicious positive feedback cycle we talked about, right?
yeah,
It's like that's like two puddles making each other ice cubes, kind of, and this is the reverse, right? Does
this
that
is the
make sense?
first. Yeah, and I guess what I'm just trying to say is that, and this gets back to Kyle's one of his points that I think we should get into, which is around a simple
Yeah.
set of mental habits. He ticks off things that building a capacity for cognitive empathy would require. One
Mhm.
being understanding the difference between external stimuli and our narrative in our mind. So that's the story and the stimuli problem. Two, a proper context setting of the role of emotion in the process. Great. Three, a basic understanding of both attribution and confirmation error. Great. Then he says, four, a simple set of mental habits that we do on a daily basis around easy cognitive empathy activities. I think as the bigger moments will eventually arise and challenge those those habits. So it's like practicing it, so that when there is a larger conflagration, you have some wherewithal and skill in navigating it during easier times. I've really noticed the difference when I went home for the holidays. I hadn't seen one of my sisters in a couple decades. Long history of conflict there. Just being able to reflect back what the other person's saying, maybe or maybe not contributing anything beyond that. I just found it goes a long way to diffusing the escalation potential.
You mean just saying, so you're saying that,
is this what you
start
mean?
the sentence that way. So
Yeah.
you're saying that, or so you mean that, so I get it. So you yeah.
And did I get that right?
Yeah. Approach it as a question. That's interesting. So, and look, there are plenty of opportunities to be reminded to try to exercise cognitive empathy. If you treat every time you're annoyed by something anyone does, even somebody online, even somebody on TV, as an opportunity to step back and say, okay, why did they do this thing that annoyed me? And just take your best shot at that. Like, what were they thinking? What motivates them, and so on. Then you'll, if nothing else, get a lot of practice, because if you're like me, there's a lot of things people do to annoy you. So look, Josh, we've been talking about this for more than an hour. We should probably wind it up for now. There's plenty to still talk about. There's more that people said we got, that was very valuable. I mean, I think I benefited from everything people said, either in the comment section or via email. I encourage them to continue to use those avenues to talk about this stuff. The comment section in the newsletter. There's always a newsletter post associated with these podcasts that people can go to. And again, the comments are for paid subscribers, but anyone can email us at nonzero.news@gmail.com. And if you put cognitive empathy in the subject heading, it will find its way to the appropriate place. Before we go, I wanted to give you a chance to say anything else you want to say about your own situation, because I think I've once again proven that couples counseling is not what I was put on this planet to do. I don't, but so I don't feel like I mean, I doubt you came here seeking my wisdom anyway. It was, I think you were sharing things about your situation for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, and I'm sure they did benefit. But is there anything else you want to say? Anything about that, or
Not necessarily so much on the side of like relationship work or couples therapy. It's more, I really am a fan of what you're doing, and I mean, it's the idea of that you've used before, this idea of self-care to maybe world care. That what's good for the individual is good for the collective. And I think that the main thing I'm trying to express is that mindfulness practice or meditation practice, spirituality in general, can be used in a way that is not necessarily oriented in the direction of greater integration and health. There's a whole concept of spiritual bypassing, where people, like you said at one point in the beginning, people that come to practice are usually coming because their life isn't necessarily going the way they want it to go. So they're kind of struggling with stuff. But in terms of what they're struggling with, they often can use the practice, and I did myself, to go around the pain, to go around the difficulty, to go around the unfinished business, when really the movement of the practice, the heart of it, goes into and faces the difficulty. And I think that's what's exciting now, in Western Buddhism, Western spirituality in general, how to take and integrate the best forms of practice, the best forms of therapy, the best models. And this is what I'm interested in. What you're doing is like, what is your model for not just naming and articulating the role and function of cognitive empathy, but a practice form? Like, I mean, one thing I should get out is you're aware of mindfulness-based stress reduction, right?
Yeah.
John Kabat-Zinn's work. So that's sort of mindfulness 1.0. Then Danny Goleman and the guy at Google, they came up with emotional intelligence, and the guy at Google, I forget his name now, but he wrote a book, Search Inside Yourself, combining mindfulness and emotional intelligence for leadership development. I think there's a case for mindfulness 3.0 or 4.0 or something like that, which you're getting at, around how does the practice specifically get tailored to strengthen this capacity?
Cognitive empathy, I mean.
Cognitive empathy. But I think you mentioned before we started taping, you're going to be speaking, or should I say this, who you're going to have on?
I'm going to be talking to Gabor Mate.
Gabor?
Or Mate, maybe he pronounces it. About his his latest book, but he's for some time focused on the role of trauma in various things, including addiction, and that's one theme in the latest book. What is the book called? It's like the Myth of Normal or something, right? It's like, but that's not the name. I'll find it quickly. But anyway, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Well, just that I think trauma is involved as a roadblock or hurdle to cognitive empathy, and working with trauma is going to involve the body. So some sort of body practice or body awareness, body care goes a long way to rewiring faulty connections that short circuit the cognitive empathy capacity.
Yeah, turns out the book is called The Myth of Normal, so I got one right. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the conversation because I'm a little bit of a trauma skeptic, you might say. Or I don't know how to put it, but not. It's complicated. I guess maybe it's I have kind of a pedantic question about whether trauma is a misleading term for some of the things we call trauma, just in the sense that it has to do with the meaning of pathology and what things are when pathology is an appropriate term and so on. There's no point in getting into it now, but I haven't even articulated my questions for him. But I'm looking forward to the conversation, which will be in a couple of weeks, few weeks. So anyway, yeah, all true, and we can get into that at some future date. I think the role of trauma. But anyway, I'm glad you're on board with the mission of figuring out this cognitive empathy thing. Of course, I'm writing a book on it, and so I have my own, have various reasons I want to get clearer on how you can cultivate it. I think we agree that mindfulness can play a role, and one thing that's become clearer to me in processing this feedback from people, and this is why it's been so valuable, is that there are different ways that mindfulness can cultivate cognitive empathy. I think I've started out with kind of the most obvious, which is just that if you're more equanimous, less judgmental, you and mindfulness in theory can make you that way, then you'll be probably better at cognitive empathy. But there are these other ways we've talked about that I think a mindfulness practice can facilitate cognitive empathy. So I hope to understand that more clearly. So, thanks to all the people who wrote in, and wish I had time to mention everything. Who was it who said that one problem they face is that if they're intent on practicing cognitive empathy, and it's harder to remain part of a group that has a well-defined enemy. And I know exactly what you mean. I just wish I could.
Yeah, that was in the back of my tongue, is that I've also seen how much, we've talked about this before, but the conflation between explanation and justification.
Yeah.
And I've I've got friends in the IR world, and they jump down my throat when I try.
International relations. Yeah.
Yeah, and and then even on the domestic level, when I try to explain myself, I can often hear that it gets interpreted as a justification for the behavior. I'm like, I'm not condoning, I'm not apologizing for it.
Right.
I'm just saying this is why I think I'm doing this crazy thing that's driving you nuts. But I mean, that's I don't even know what would be the bias that blinds someone from able to see the distinction between explanation and justification.
Well, that's a long story I plan to get into in the book, but I think it's just part of human nature that literally part of it's another kind of fallacy that I think is part of human nature, that the conflation of explaining why someone did something and defending the thing they did. I think those during human evolution were so often one and the same, that we kind of our equipment naturally processes things as though they were. But I don't even totally understand that story myself. By the way, the person's name is Nex, Nex Ninek. This was in a comment, and the comment was, seeing things through the lens of cognitive empathy has its pros and cons. One of the cons is that it becomes really hard to remain active in a group that has a quote enemy. And then he goes on, or he or she goes on to talk about a group they're part of that's involved in a lawsuit. Anyway, that's what I was looking for. So we should go, but thank you for being part of this. Thanks for sharing, as they say, which you did to a really commendable extent. You did more sharing than I did. Maybe it'll be my turn next time.
Hey,
But I'll have to get my wife's permission. I'm hoping she'll refuse to give it. So thank you, Josh.
thank you, Bob. Great to see you.
We should return to all this. I'll let you get back to the various challenges associated with thoroughly fusing one's personal and professional life and living in a secluded place while doing it. But thanks
Could
so
be
much.
worse. Could be worse.
Oh, I'm sure it could be a lot worse for all of us. Okay, take care.
Yep, thanks.